Hi, I'm Alex Howard, and welcome to the show. And my guest in the studio today is Martin Aylward. Hi, Martin. And Martin is a Buddhist teacher who has been teaching retreats around the world for the last 15 years, and who has particular interest in bringing Buddhist teaching into everyday life. And in today's interview, we're going to be talking about mindfulness, and many of you watching this will be aware that over the last year or two especially, there's been a huge surge in popularity applications of mindfulness, even to the point I read an article recently about mindfulness being used in the military. So we're going to explore mindfulness generally and some of these more recent applications. Maybe, Martin, the good starting point, though, would be just what is mindfulness? What do we mean when we talk of mindfulness?
Well, there's lots of ways we could define it in a way. The term mindfulness, as has become popularized and, like you say, is spreading more and more into culture and into interventions in psychotherapy and business practice and health and education and the military and other places, comes from a term within the Buddhist tradition. The original Buddha used is sati sampajanya, and meaning to recall, to recollect, to come back to oneself. So there's that sense of the gathering of attention. The gathering of attention in the immediacy of experience. The gathering of attention in the place where your experience is happening. Now it's hard to say, where is this experience happening, right? But the sense of here-ness, and particularly helpful, the visceral sense of here-ness. So having a sense of embodied attention. So sati means that sense of gathering and embodying and grounding your attention in the immediacy of experience. And then the sampajanya part means a clear comprehension, an understanding of what this is, what's happening. So we could say mindfulness is the giving close and curious and caring attention in an immediate, embodied way to what's happening for the purposes of understanding experience more fully and allowing experience to unfold more freely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I guess one of the things that's been, I think, very popular about mindfulness, in a sense, is its simplicity and its inclusiveness, in a sense, in terms of our immediate experience, rather than that being something to transcend or avoid or get away from. But it strikes me that there's a simplicity to mindfulness which doesn't equate to an easiness to mindfulness.
Right.
You know, you can describe in a short interview what mindfulness is, but of course the living embodiment of that is it's a lifetime's practice.
Yeah, well, because that simple, like you say, intention to ground one's attention in the present moment, in one's embodied experience, just that, as we see when we start to practice, there's a lifetime of deepening that, because the tendency, mind moves. So the tendency of our mind is to go here and there and to abstract itself into an image of what's happening, an interpretation of what's happening, and further to abstract itself into all kinds of projections about what could or should be happening, and to further lose itself in all kinds of kind of nostalgia or regret about what was happening and what should have happened and what would have been different if it had happened differently, etc. Right? So just that. The sense of seeing how attention loses itself and the engagement with training your mind to stay, to settle, to open, to be curious, to kind of gently and spaciously hold what's happening. And then the endless deepening of the intention to understand what this is, this human experience. I mean, just what sensory experience is. The miracle of the kind of fluid changing nature of what we see and hear and taste and smell. And then the realms of the way concept and thought forms and unforms, the way emotions move within us, the way we tend to get so seduced by our own thinking that it reinforces a quite rigid and limited sense of self that actually starts to that rigidity starts to break down and open up. under the scrutiny, if you like, of really applying mindfulness.
Yes. Can you say, before we start to come to some of these different applications, just something about the actual practice of mindfulness? You mentioned, for example, it's partly a training of the mind to not be distracted and pulled away. How does someone do that?
Well, I would say it's, again, I could talk for a long time about this.
I'm aware of this.
It's twofold, I would say. One is the kind of real ground of mind training, like training your attention to be able to stay, and meditation practice, formal meditation practice as the engine of that training, if you like. The willingness to sit down with yourself every day or in whatever rhythm and just attend to the way mind moves. Mm-hmm. And to establish a kind of invitation to mind to settle and to stay. And in some ways, mind just keeps on showing itself as being very resistant to that invitation, right? And
really?
Faced with just sitting here and using the most simple aspect of experience that I possibly can, right? The fact of being here and that breathing is happening, for example. And just inviting one's attention to stay connected with that. And the way almost anything else shows up as being more interesting than that, right? So the formality of meditation as a training of one's attention becoming more sensitive to what's happening. And of one's attention learning to release and leave alone that kind of restless, hungry seeking, and to learn to appreciate something about immediacy, about stability, about the wonder, actually, of just this ordinary, moment-by-moment unfolding experience. That as we attend to it, it opens up. And actually, just the fluidity of body sensation right now, just the movement of breath, just the fact that there is sensory experience starts to show itself as being extraordinary, miraculous, unfathomably deep and wondrous and fragile and precious, because we don't know how long this experience is going to last. So that's the one part of it, is the formality of meditation training. And then the other wing of that, and both wings are equally important, is the way one applies that training of the mind to the rest of your life.
Yes.
The way you notice, in a more relational sense, for example, where's my attention when I'm just talking to you? The way we start to notice how often our attention in relationship, for example, is kind of out there, anticipating what's happening, measuring oneself in terms of what's happening, trying to work out what you think of me, or what you might say next, or what I'm going to say in response to you, or all manner of kind of the building up of layers in that way. And, applying the mind training of meditation to letting oneself dare to trust, not replaying so much, not rehearsing so much, and actually creating the space to meet this moment, this contact, this activity, whatever it is. So both the formal element of mindfulness training, which we might call meditation, and the application of that into any and every sphere of life, I would say those two are what the practice is.
Yes. And it seems to me that when we really land here, and we land in ourselves, there's something else that happens, which is different to kind of, as you say, predicting the future, remembering the past. And it seems to me that one of the reasons why we get so caught in that egoic way of being is because there's a lack of contact with one way to put it is a depth of trust or a depth of contact, that therefore we have this panic that we need to predict what's going to happen or work it out, or something else happens when we're here.
Yeah. And of course we've grown up learning to construct a sense of self and then rely on that sense of self and then get busy trying to fix that sense of self, trying to improve the good bits, trying to ignore or get away with or abandon the bad bits, etc. And so that process of self-reinforcement is a process of abstraction. It's a process of meaning making. It's a process of storytelling again and again to ourselves. So much so that we believe our own rhetoric to the point that we don't even notice it happening anymore. So even although in one way we kind of long for, that sense of immediacy, of spaciousness, of a kind of letting ourselves land in our experience. At the same time, as that starts to happen, as we develop the capacity to settle and land in our experience a little more, it's quite disorientating and actually quite confronting, because there's no space in that for the familiar rhetoric of self-belief. And that's very disorientating, because even though this self-belief gives me all kinds of complexities and trouble, it's, there's something, that's what I've relied on.
Sure.
My version of myself, my story of myself.
And it's, who am I if I'm not this?
Right.
What's there?
Right. So the practice is an opportunity to find that out, if you like, but it's also inevitably the opportunity to come in contact with the fear and disorientation that we assume is going to be the fruits of not having all that self-referencing.
And
it's like if I don't
arises at the start as well.
If I don't know myself in the familiar way, who the hell will I be?
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting question, of course.
Right.
And I guess that's also where good teaching and guidance helps someone to navigate that, which I think it is. It's very unsettling territory initially.
Yeah. And the navigating being to keep staying open to the question of that, which is much more important than finding an answer.
Yes.
Right? I've never found any kind of satisfactory answer to without familiar self-referencing, who am I?
Yeah.
Right? But the willingness to keep asking the question is the willingness to keep putting away the familiar self-referencing.
Yes.
And the fruits of that are that we inhabit a life that reveals ever more its fluidity, its freedom, its spaciousness. And the way that works on us is that the more we trust that, the more we live that sense of trust, of ease, of fluidity. But it seems like that's not, the way that happens is by passing through the fear and disorientation and mistrust and the kind of fervent, I want to let go of all that self stuff. And at the same time, I'm very uneasy about what I might find if I do that.
Yeah, and it seems that it's a transitionary process in a sense, and it takes time, and it takes a kind of building of a landing of somewhere else, which isn't that egoic self. I want to.
Or I would say, just to rather of a landing somewhere else that isn't that egoic self, I would say it's rather a learning a degree of ease with just not landing anywhere.
Yes.
Right. Of actually just of softening around the need to land, the need to land in a something, in a sense of identity, in a sense of certainty. So that it's. Mindfulness is a present continuous in a way, like that sense of recollecting, of coming back to ourselves. So the orientation is as if towards landing in experience. I mean, that's the languaging of it, but actually there is no landing in, because experience is always shifting.
Yeah.
There's a nice image that Jack Cornfield, I heard say once. He says, practice is like at first jumping out of a plane and realizing you have no parachute, right? Nowhere to land. Yeah. It's like, it's like that sense of free fall, and one's familiar reference points are gone, and that's disorientating.
Yeah, sure.
And then he says, after a while, you realize there's no ground. And that's a beautiful image. Sometimes when I've said that in a teaching setting, I've heard people gasp. And I say, there's no ground. It's kind of terrifying, and yet there's something about that sense of free fall through life that if we believe there's a ground to land on, we're always braced for the impact.
And we need a parachute.
Right. And yet if there's no ground, there's a kind of natural ease with this free movement through life.
Yeah. So I want to come into a bit where we started right at the beginning around these different applications of mindfulness, because what we're exploring at the moment is something with a real depth and a sincerity of experience to it, and I'm being deliberately provocative here, saying that how does that meet warfare and the military? And I'm curious as to your thoughts about that.
Yeah. Well, within the Buddhist tradition, which in which mindfulness practice is really embedded within a whole kind of an ethical framework and a whole wide and deep body of practices, then I think there's definitely some concern about seeing mindfulness kind of spreading out widely into the culture at all. Mm-hmm. Sometimes in some very beautiful ways, sometimes in ways that we might hardly recognize from within that sort of context of Buddhist teachings. And some concerns about it being used to further corporate greed, military aggression,
mindful millionaire,
etc., etc. Right.
Yeah.
And I think it's important because sometimes that concern or criticism is coming from the place where there's the assumption that what's being taught people is just the training of their attention, right? Just learning to be, but that isn't mindfulness. I would say that's concentration, right? That's just learning to attend to something in a concentrated way. Mm-hmm. But if I go back a little to the definition I gave earlier, that sense of attending to experience in order to understand what's happening more fully, in order to allow it more freely. So the sense of kind of attuning to experience for the purposes of opening it up, for the purposes of transforming the heart, if you like. Mm-hmm. That's what's significant, right? And therefore, there's actually very beautiful examples within the context that we might look askance at, the context that don't look like they're aligned with spiritual values, if you like. Examples within corporations or within working in the military, where even though the people doing the hiring, right, the generals it may be, or the head of HR or in the corporation or whatever, even though they might be hoping that what they're going to get is more leaner, meaner, more efficient soldiers or workers or whatever, that actually you can't really engage this stuff without engaging your heart, without engaging some existential questioning of, well, what is this consciousness that's paying attention? And so it tends to be that either people don't really connect with the practice, right? And in which case it doesn't make much difference to them.
Or it becomes like a tool that they try and use or whatever.
Or if they do connect with the practice, it starts to wake up. They get a lot more than they bargained for often. It starts to wake up some of these existential questions. It starts to wake up one's kind of moral compass in relationship to life. It wakes up one's sense actually of solidarity with all other beings. It's like, I think I'm so special and unique, but actually these teachings I'm getting about the way mind is and the way emotions work, that's how they work. Yeah. The Buddha was talking about this stuff 2,500 years ago. And what he says about how mind moves and how emotions work, that's the same for me now. And so that sense that, this is not how I am, but this is how life is. This is how people are. This is how hearts feel. That sense of solidarity, empathy, care, sensitivity, that stuff wakes up along with one's capacity to settle one's attention. Yes. And that's where the real potency and beauty for transformation is possible.
Yeah, and so in a sense in what you're saying, the I don't know what the word is, the kind of mass spreading, as it were, of mindfulness, if it's a gateway in for someone to have a deeper experience of something else happening, actually there's a great value in that.
I think there's a great value, and I think it is our way in, if you like. If you look at Buddhism, for example, in Asia, there's what we might call entryway into practice, which in Asia was going to the temple, making prostrations, lighting incense, praying for good karma, etc. And then out of that, what we might call entryway into the practice, some will develop a deeper sense of possibility and feel that kind of longing to transform their life. And then that's another step, right, to actually start training your mind and following a teacher, etc. Now, lighting incense and making bows is never going to, in our culture, just ain't going to be our entryway.
Sure,
right?
sure.
So I see mindfulness in a way, in all its many secular flavors, as that kind of entryway. And it may be that people find a little bit of ease and a little bit of stress relief and a little bit of possibility to settle their mind a bit more, in which case that's a good thing. And it'll also be that some see a great depth of possibility in that and are able to follow it, the practice, and stay steady in their commitment in such a way that really opens up and transforms them.
Yes. I guess in a sense what you're saying is it's planting a seed, and that seed may not sprout immediately. It may be that something happens, they have an experience, and then a year later they have a crisis in their life and that seed starts to blossom somehow.
For example.
Yeah. So we've got about a minute or so left. I'm aware that you run mindfulness practitioner trainings. And I know that it's looking like it's on 3 continents. So just say something about the kind of spreading of that. It sounds like that there's been a very organic process of just people wanting more.
Yeah, well, seeing that people are working with mindfulness within therapy and within healthcare and education, etc., and yet often having a sense that they need a greater context and they want to have that grounded in a more formal training. And some of those trainings for people to teach mindfulness have happened within the secular mindfulness world. But we also sensed, actually out of a conversation with a group of Buddhist teachers which were expressing some concern for the way that was happening. And my sense, and my colleague Mark Coleman was saying, well, it's out there. And there's nothing we can do about the fact that it's out there. And there's no point complaining about the fact that it's out there. But if we feel that it could benefit from the kind of the depth and the grounding and the ethical context that the tradition provides, yes, then that seemed like our responsibility, or at least an opportunity to really provide that. So that's what we've started doing. And there's a year-long training happening at the moment in the UK and another one starting in California. And then it seems like that's starting to spread, and the request has been to lead them elsewhere.
Great.
So.
And can you give us a website for that?
mindfulnesstrainings.com is where people can find out more about that.
Brilliant. Well, thank you, Martin. And thank you for watching. And we look forward to talking with you again at some point very soon. Bye-bye.